Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time you're watching this. I want to go through what the emotional crux is for me regarding the 9/11 conspiracy, because there's so many elements to the conspiracy, and there's so many elements. One of the elements is controlled demolition conspiracy theory of how the World Trade Center was destroyed. But even that has lots of elements. There's the reasons why people believe it. Were the airplanes enough damage? Was there molten metal? What does that mean? Etc., etc., etc. And I decided to start with Wikipedia and kind of go through sort of a narrative journey here where it kind of aligns with what I had to whittle down to what my core issue was. So I highlighted here that, along with Stephen E. Jones, Richard Gage, Jim Hoffman, and David Ray Griffin, the buildings, based on their damage and fire, would have neither collapsed completely nor at the speeds they did without additional energy involved to weaken the structure. So the two words that I want to focus on here are completely and at the speed they did. In other words, if it was incomplete or if it was slower, you could have it fast and incomplete or slow and complete. So that combination of complete and speed is something that is bothering me. And so, but as you know, I'm not an expert. And look, it says here all these experts, which we will do a deep dive into, they said no evidence that there was any controlled demolition. So we'll look at who each of these people are and what they actually say. But before we do that, let's go back to my non-expert intuition here. So instead of a building, let's use a bus, for example. Now, my question is, would this bus at any scale, giant, tiny, made of any material, wood, metal, glass, could be strong or soft, heavy or light, brittle or flexible, with any, let's say, drop height. So as you can see, there's a full bus here, and I'm sort of asking multiple questions in this hypothetical scenario. So what would you imagine happening if this smaller section of the bus ran into this larger section of the bus? And then I just sort of tilted up. Now, what if we just dropped it? What if we dropped it from a really far distance, or it fell really fast? Could the whole bus undergo a rapid and total collapse with the force of gravity alone? What if the pieces were already touching, and as you could see in this damaged zone? So let's say, somebody put fire and damage in this upper section here. What if that smaller section the upper section, was made of lighter material than the larger lower section? So in other words, what if the steel in the front of the bus was thicker and got progressively thinner as it went to the end of the bus? Could you imagine modifying these parameters in any way with the force of gravity, having this whole bus just get pulverized? The bus could be as big as a skyscraper. It could be as big as a planet. It could be as small as an atom. It could be made of, whatever. It doesn't make sense to me that you can have an essentially intact structure that's essentially uniform with its separate components that could, withstand vertical loads, or, in the case of the bus, loads in that direction, and just have the whole thing pulverize. So, I'm interested in that, regardless of what the theory is behind it. So how does this relate exactly to the towers? So these are to scale for each of the towers. It's more fascinating with World Trade Center Tower 1, which was the North Tower, where green is the intact, undamaged portion. This is the damage zone, so there's various asymmetrical damage in here, and this is where the fires roughly were. And the upper section is the section that was intact once the collapse initiated. So we know roughly what floor the collapse initiated and where it fell through. And it's a complex structure. 287 or 240 exterior columns, 47 core columns, 40 trusses per floor, all interconnected, interwelded. And as you can see, here's the thick lower core columns, and these are how thin the upper columns were. And this is the whole structure, this disturbing picture of the World Trade Center on fire with the airplane damage inside it, representing this area up here. Now, let's just take a purely investigative approach. We're not making any assumptions. We have an intuition that maybe that intuition works or doesn't work for you. But for me, I'm coming into this with the bias that imagining damaging this end of the bus and letting gravity have its way doesn't result in everything getting destroyed, no matter how heavy the pieces are, because as soon as you make this part heavy and thick, you're making the bottom part heavy and thick. So, turn up the gravity. Maybe that's, since we're, that could be equivalent to the square cube law, perhaps, if you made the bus gigantic. But anyways, I still don't really understand it, and I don't 100% buy it. So I'm sure there's science or scientists or government officials that explain this, because this is what a big reason, as we could see up here, is what's fueling these controlled demolition conspiracy theories. Well, this is basically the standard normie package you got here, the 9/11 Commission report, which has a whole bunch of issues. The kind of outdated Popular Mechanics book. You have the Smithsonian thing that is a horrible animation that doesn't explain anything. There's no detail in it whatsoever. And you have this blog written by somebody. None of this is addressing the speed or the completeness. They like to nitpick on a million other things. Well, who is this conspiracy crowd anyway? Well, you have the sort of mainstream conspiracy crowd, the loud radio host Alex Jones. Back in 2007, I was into this, loose change, but this was kind of the mainstream middle ground of the conspiracy world. There was actually fringe extremes even in the realm of conspiracy people. So let's see. You have here on the top the really crazy conspiracy people. And it's not for lack of credentials, but they just have the wildest. They made books and documentaries on how secret lizard people rule the world, or lasers from space destroyed the World Trade Center, secret nuke bombs, all kinds of stuff. This in plain sight is one of the no plane theories. You get into holograms and all kinds of weird stuff. So there's a range of credibility and quality in alternative speculation here. But then on the other side, you have David Ray Griffin, he's a scholar. You have Stephen Jones, who, he's from Brigham Young, and, he dabbled in cold fusion. So you can kind of poke fun at him there for that. But, he knows what he's talking about within his area of expertise. So, he wasn't doing anything sensational. He was interested in scholarly work on these topics. So you have all this group of people, and you're trying to figure out, I just want to know how the World Trade Center was destroyed. and the official explanation didn't give me anything. These guys, they don't really, I mean, they agree with my intuition that it doesn't make sense, but they have all this other baggage. So we have these guys that are a little more boring. I kind of don't understand what they're almost above my head a little bit in terms of their technical expertise, but then you have crazy people that are just as credentialed. So you just kind of almost want to throw your hands up. Or what if I just want to understand how it works? Like, let's say there was no conspiracy. How in the hell did those buildings fail? Well, the internet is more than happy to try to debunk all the conspiracies. We have, I think these guys are like pretty dang mainstream in terms of debunking. So we got Mick West. He has a whole website called Metabunk, and it's all about debunking everything, essentially. But, it's couched as, oh, we're just truth seekers. But there's definitely some tribalism going on in there in terms of a bias against any so-called spectacular theories. But it's good. They, like, for example, right here, they're when you come to the nitty-gritty, you want to have valid reasons for believing in something. So if they can debunk it, well, then you shouldn't use that as a reason to believe it. Saban here, he's interesting because he has amazing 3D world quality videos, but he's just dead wrong on everything, like laughably wrong. So like I included an example here that he blames World Trade Center 7 getting damaged by Tower 1's spire hitting it, but the spire fell the other way. So this is all just speculation. In this one, he's talking about the World Trade Center itself, one of the towers collapsing. And in the animation, it totally cheats. Like, it's just animated. Like, you could see, first of all, it's slow, so it doesn't answer the speed. And even though it just says the words increasing momentum, the video itself is, and there's a whole stacked pile of floors, which isn't what happened. They're all exploded laterally. And then, but you could see if you watch some of his videos, like, some metal bars going through each other in the animation. So it's like glitching video game stuff. But he gets like millions of views. And this guy, Edward Current, he makes fun of religious people and 9/11 conspiracy people. And he has a whole playlist on trying to debunk things. And, here's, for example, World Trade Center 7. He's trying to explain it by like these columns buckling, but this had more than just 2 columns. This isn't in any official reports. This is all just speculation. We couldn't see what was going on down here. The official report said nothing about the moment frame doing this buckling. And so it's pretty easy to be, tricked or convinced, like, oh, maybe that's how it happened. But when you realize it's actually, he's excluding like 80 core perimeter columns. I forget how many. There's a lot. And all the core columns. And he references videos that like these that are easily debunked. It's just, unfortunately, not convincing. So it leaves me scratching my head. Well, decided to revisit it after a long time. And, I guess I underestimated some of the conspiracy quality. So I knew about architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, but I never actually sat down and watched these documentaries they made. And when I did, it was crazy how eye-opening it was. So many things that I didn't think were resolved. Here is the expert explaining it and resolving everything. There was even a documentary from Canada about 9/11 in the academic community that was like shadow banned to hell. Like, it took me forever to even find out this thing existed, and no wonder. 7 is a documentary about Larry. What's his name? It's funny. I have his name in another slide, but basically he completed a reevaluation of the World Trade Center 7 issue, which is, goes hand in hand and came out the same year as this one, which was an initiative from the firefighters because they can see other anomalies that, a structural engineer may not be focused on. So like between these two, they pretty much demolished the official story. And then I recently learned about Roland Angle, and he has these very long, he made a thing called Project Due Diligence, which is instead of trying to convince the general public, he's just trying to convince other architects and engineers. So he made a giant PowerPoint aimed at only structural engineers and professional engineers. And, it was quite convincing and like very thorough. And then you have these two guys, David Chandler and John Cole, and they're essentially the same level of quality, and they actually do original research. So this guy does experiments, and this guy does measurements and footage observations with, his software that has been validated. It's like he's even corrected the official government. Like he was part of the, feedback when they were doing their analysis. So he's not just some nobody. Like he actually proved, the rate of collapse and influenced how the investigation began. He couldn't quite do as much as he could, but he was in the room. So, we were kind of making fun of these official stories. All right, well, what about the engineering community, the professional community? Why aren't we hearing anything from them? Why isn't there this critical mass of, experts saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense? Well, if we go to, I think there's a lot of, one, they all have a full plate on, they're fully employed. They got their own projects they're working on. And two, they don't see a need because they see that reports have already been made. They didn't look into the details for themselves. And you'll see as we go through this why I think that's even more justified the more you learn. So what are the official government explanations? And I got these from Wikipedia. So I already knew about them, but these are the same people that are referenced in the Wikipedia article. But one thing to note is that our whole issue was the rate of the collapse and the totality of the collapse. That has to do with the collapse progression. All the official reports, especially this one, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they're only focused on collapse initiation, and they assume global collapse. Like they literally just write one sentence. Well, of course, once it has started, initiated, global collapse would ensue. It's a pretty big assumption. And they all disagree with each other. So Thomas Egger thinks that the trusses failed due to fire. Ron Hamburger thinks that there was a splice failure due at the seat of the trusses. These are both pancake collapse theories, which I'm sure you've heard. This private investigation attributed to core columns failing from damage and heat. And then NIST said that no, it was the perimeter columns that were buckling inwards, and then the columns themselves buckled. So there's no consensus here. The NIST one is the official one. I don't know how they got away with him having a totally different theory, but the reason why they can get away with saying, oh, well, global collapse was inevitable is they're leaning on this one guy, Bazant. He, 2 days after the attacks, submitted a paper, Why Did the World Trade Center Collapse? A simple analysis. What he did was he made a one-dimensional mathematical model, not three-dimensional, not two-dimensional, one-dimensional, line hitting line. So that builds in symmetry automatically, which is part of the problem of the collapse. And he also assumed a rigid upper section for the crush down phase. So in other words, he's imagining like this piston that's just falling intact the whole way, even though the footage you see it disintegrate pretty much immediately. Not only does he put that into his math, He also puts in that the bottom floors just get automatically compacted and then gain mass, and so it just crushes everything down. No structural detail was included in his analysis, and his theory has never been empirically validated. In fact, he uses the footage to validate it. So it's sort of a descriptive theory. It's not really predicting anything or explaining anything. It's just describing, it went down this fast. And it ignores key footage details. The only exception to that is this one random guy in 2022 who decided to go 2D. Whoa, the big man on campus. And his doesn't match anybody's theory. He's all the way back to pancake collapse again. So whatever, man. None of this is explaining anything to me. I just want to know. Well, in order to know, you got to know really what they're saying and understand it. Because sometimes just understanding what they're saying makes their explanation fail. So, for example, I was actually more convinced of the conspiracy the better I understood NIST's analysis. So they did the World Trade Center Twin Towers. In their computer models, even before the collapse, they were adding artificial values to force the computer model to match the footage. Like they added 5,000 pounds of lateral force to buckle the columns, even though their computer model wouldn't do it. And then for World Trade Center 7, forget it. They attribute the entire collapse to one girder failing, which caused a chain of events to make one column fail, which caused a chain of events to make the whole thing fall. And none of it made any sense, and all the details were wrong. And they excluded all kinds of details about the structure, which we have pictures of, and they refused to correct it. And they refused to release their simulation inputs. So very not transparent or explanatory at all. It was like, we just need to say something that looks official. Let's get it the fuck done. So here's the only model that captures the entire collapse process. Crush down, then crush up. This is that one-dimensional model represented here in 2D, so you don't lose your brain. And he kind of baked in those assumptions. The crush front formed across the whole width, continued it such all the way down. Forget that the fact that damage was asymmetric. Idealized as one-dimensional. My estimation, he baked into this sort of a heads you I win, tails you lose. So it'll trip up people trying to point out the issues there's so many, but he kind of made this little idealistic playground where he knows the math. And even though it's totally divorced from reality, he can do a gotcha easily in his mathematical equations. So there are some people that went up against him and failed. Even though the spirit of their argument was correct, because they weren't experts in those types of calculations and formulations, he was able to just dismiss them and make them look stupid. So here's this guy, he's a lawyer, and he's like, Newton's third law of motion requires an equal and opposite reaction. When two objects strike, that striking force is applied to both the upper and lower sections. Well, Bazant's like, you're even saying the words Newton's third law like you're a beginner, and it's already baked into the math, so you don't even know what you're talking about, you idiot. And then Zoodle, this guy, I can't pronounce his last name, who's actually not as, he's much more within his realm of expertise in critiquing Bazant. He failed on his first attempt too. He's done subsequent attempts. And then we have this guy he's one of the crazies, but he, just like the space laser level crazy, but he took a stab at Bazant, and he was so close, but he didn't quite make his case. And then Bazant could just run all over him with all of his math. And so therefore it's settled in the science. Well, this guy didn't stop. He did subsequent work critiquing. I made a timeline actually of all the back and forth. I should show that in here. And then we have this guy. I haven't read this book, but this is another one aimed at architects and engineers. That the whole gravity alone hypothesis doesn't work. So, color me intrigued. I still don't understand how they were fully collapsed so completely and rapidly. I kind of went crazy and bought a bunch of books just to, now that I feel like there's something more to this, I'm going to be educated in all the ways. So these are just the pile of books I bought. And of course, Jim Hoffman, he's the guy who did the Progressive Collapse Challenge that aligned perfectly with my intuitions about how it just doesn't make sense to me. And I'm just itching for an answer. So a lot of those so this guy, a historian wrote these. This is David Ray Griffin's stuff. The lawyer actually composed this, but it was on an international hearing with a bunch of scientists. All of these have great Kevin Ryan. That's a whole other rabbit hole. So part of why I'm showing you all these pictures in this video is if you're watching this and it's sort of a shotgun approach. If something stands out to you that's interesting, you can look into it further. I'm just showing you kind of a high-level summary of everything I put together. So we got this guy who found the active thermitic material in the dust. He posted it in Bentham Science, which is a shit journal, but no one's debunked him. And he put it out there, and he's waiting. And somebody actually tried, this guy, Millett, in 2012, tried, and the last thing we got from him was a revised report of results. It wasn't peer reviewed, and it was sort of a nothing burger. And then we have Leroy Holsey, who's the guy who did the reevaluation of World Trade Center 7 using better software, and basically said that the way it collapsed was absolutely impossible as described with gravity driven. There was just no way. And it's funny, when Niels published this, NIST responded. They said, there's no clear chain of custody to prove the 4 samples came from the World Trade Center site. So Jones invited NIST to conduct their own studies using its own chain of custody dust, but NIST did not investigate. In other words, when it came to this guy in trying to debunk the fact that there's unignited incendiaries or explosives, high tech, almost like alien level tech thermite in the dust, instead of saying, oh yeah, we could prove it, no problem, they're just like, well, how do we know that came from the World Trade Center? So what they're essentially implying, they're essentially granting that it's high tech explosives, but that the chain of custody is the problem. So why would this guy write this whole report? What doesn't make sense to me is he faked this, and now, what is he getting out of it? And I compare that to what did the Department of Defense and the Bush administration and the military-industrial complex and the deep state get out of 9/11. $7 trillion, control of the Middle East. Anyways. Okay, so if there was something fishy going on, somebody would have said something. This is a little... This is like where I feel like nobody's acting in good faith. There's snakes everywhere, and then there's cowards, and then there's brave people, like all over. It's like such a dramatic thing. Like, it's crazy. So this guy, he actually worked. He was an employee of NIST, and when he saw their reports on the World Trade Center, he was appalled and quit, because he was like, this is like fraud. And he's like, I thought we were a reputable place. And he's worked on other reports for other projects, and he never saw anything so bad. Kevin Ryan and Barry Jennings, Google them and go down that rabbit hole. There's a lot. But what pisses me off is when, one of the, like Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Center, he said, hopefully this, report, the official report, puts to rest the various 9/11 conspiracy theories which dishonor the men and women who lost their lives on that terrible day. This is such a common saying that, if you think the Trade Center was destroyed by some other method, you're dishonoring. Like, what the fuck? I hate that line of argumentation, because it's not a line of argumentation. It's a psychological tactic to silence you, and it pisses me off. And then the guy who's the lead NIST investigator, when people are said, he could not explain why the skepticism wouldn't die. He said, I'm really not a psychologist. So a nice way to insinuate that there's crazies. What can I do? Not engaging with the content of their critiques at all. And that's adding insult to injury, because he couldn't figure out, even he admitted as late as like 2006 or 7, we're really struggling to figure out World Trade Center 7. Like they were late on their report, and then by the time they delivered it, it was this crazy explanation that made no sense. And then he's like, well, why would anyone doubt it? He couldn't even figure it out. Not only that, he had to eat his own words, because they were planning on not disclosing the 2.25 seconds of free fall, uniform symmetrical free fall. They were saying, well, that would be impossible because there'd be some resistance from the structure. So there's no way it could be free fall. Well, then David Chandler proved it with the footage. And then they had to say, oh, yeah, that was free fall for a phase. And but that phase was like 100 feet of like 100 columns all just giving way suddenly symmetrically. Well, I recently learned about this guy, Dr. Maximilian Rupert, in late 2023, who was a double punch in his credibility. He was a structural engineer and a high-rise demolition expert. And he said, you know what, I'm breaking my silence now. You could watch the video. I should put a bunch of links in the description. It might take me a while, but he basically said, yeah, I knew, everyone who knows knew. And all those reports trying to say it was gravity were a joke, and I couldn't even listen to them. And he said that, people he knew personally who knew his credentials, if he started saying anything like, yeah, those didn't make sense, he would get that extreme emotional reaction. Shut up, they were hit by planes. People died. And so he's like, wow, if I'm going to get that type of reaction, I might as well just make money and do what I got to do. Well, he, essentially feels like he has nothing to lose at this point. So that's why he went public. And he said that he wasn't the only one, and that he felt bad for being a coward. The silence doesn't mean, consensus. Silence either mean, from the expert fields. It either means they didn't investigate, they did, or and they're keeping silent. I guess I'm not convinced. It seems like there's assholes that are trying to say it was gravity driven that have ties to the government. Then you have experts who levy critiques that are just as credentialed and that are ignored. and then everyone else isn't touching it with a 10-foot pole. So it's 10:14 p.m. where I am. I'll just end it on sort of a silly note. There's lots of Wikipedias you could check out. These are like, there's the normie Wikipedia, there's the anti-conspiracy Wikipedia, and then there's like the super conspiracy Wikipedia. Try to get as much information as you can. These guys, they're closely aligned with architects and engineers. They do a lot of good work. And then the funniest thing of all is, the Onion did a joke that the Al-Qaeda was against the conspiracies because it makes them look bad. It wasn't a joke. It literally happened. So this guy, Iran president, this is like 17 years ago. He was like, yeah, I think the deep state in America did it to get into the Middle East. And Al-Qaeda spokesperson, they professed they don't believe that Al-Qaeda was behind 9/11, but rather U.S. government. So if we may ask, why would Iran ascribe such a ridiculous belief that stands in the face of all logic and evidence? Because Al-Qaeda is not, religious extremist organization. They're totally about logic and evidence. Speaking of people just being assholes, back to Bazant again. Sorry, Bazant, but you kind of are. Because when he released his paper 2 days after the event, there were some, phrases in there, very heavy-handed and worded. And he said something like, due to the ongoing discussion of the various collapse methods, there wasn't an ongoing discussion yet. The buildings just fell. It's so fucking weird, and it pisses me off. And, my confidence in the gravity collapse scenario, just the more I learn, the worse it gets. So, yeah, I'm kind of waiting for one, and I know that what it implies is crazy. And, maybe in another video, I'll show you some other crazy things, because it's much better to show than to tell. I understand demonstration makes a much more impact, but I'm a horrible video editor. But there's footage of essentially debris that is changes mid-direction as it's falling. And what the, David Chandler is attributing that to is that, the explosive material is still on that piece. And, it's firing. So it's almost like a propellant. And that's why that propellant of that piece can change direction. I can't think of any other explanation. The molten metal coming out of the corner of Tower 2, nobody's given an explanation. It's just up for grabs. The other one was, there's a video of the explosion, and it was an old video from 9/11 Witness. It was the name of the documentary. But it's of a corner section of the top portion of World Trade Center Tower 2. And as it's falling, maybe I can find it on my Twitter here, because it is ridiculous. There's so much on my Twitter that I've replied to that it might take too long. But it was crazy. It's too crazy. Maybe if I go to media, because I remember my reaction to it. Yeah, here we go. All right, look at this. You might laugh at me for thinking I'm seeing something here, but especially this one, you see the the pop, and then you see the dust because it's going throughout. And when you see that top portion, it falls through the cloud and then comes out just as dust without striking anything. So my confidence is where it is, and I'm just sharing this information, putting it on the internet so 5 people can see it and it doesn't get lost if my hard drive gets destroyed. So have fun investigating, and good luck to anybody actually trying to figure this out, because it is a bear.